So thank you very much for that introduction. It's really great to be not just in Chicago, but in Hyde Park. So I was born in the Lying-in Hospital in this neighborhood. My first home was actually the Roby House, Frank Lloyd Wright's Roby House, which at that time was graduate student housing because both of my parents were graduate students at the U of C then. And then my father moved back. I actually grew up in New York City. I left Chicago at age 2, but then I came back as an adult because my father became the academic dean at the Chicago Theological Seminary, so they just lived near here on 58th Street. So I feel like it's a lot of memories, being here in Hyde Park, and I'm really delighted that the Chicago Humanities Festival invited me to speak today. So I'm going to talk about the question of identity. If you want to know why I wrote the book, it's because Donald Trump was elected in 2016. It's very simple. And if you want to know what I think the current problem with identity is, I think that a new form of identity, well, it may not be completely new, but it's certainly very visible. We've got a very, I think, toxic version of identity politics going, which was on full display this past week, where the president kept talking about this invasion by this caravan of migrants, about all of the diseases and the terrible criminals and the Middle Easterners and all of these questionable people that were moving towards the United States and the way that he was going to defend the country against them. Now, it's odd, I actually think he's a little bit panicked about what's going to happen on Tuesday, which is why he has been escalating this rhetoric. But if you think about it, it's actually a rather odd pitch to make to American voters at a time when the economy is actually doing really, really well. People are getting jobs, wages are actually going up for the first time in a very long time. And this president is not talking about that. Rather, he's talking about how we ought to be fearful rather than happy because of this cultural invasion that's somehow going to shift America's national identity. And so how this came about is really what I've been thinking and writing about over the last couple of years especially. I think that the kind of populist politics that we see in the United States is unfortunately just a case of a much broader phenomenon around the world where you've had a number of populist politicians elected. Now, political scientists don't agree necessarily on the definition of populism. My definition is something like this, that a populist is someone that claims a mandate from the people. He or she is elected, legitimately elected, and claims this personal relationship with the people that he or she claims to represent. This charismatic personal relationship means that a populist politician is almost automatically anti-institutional. And by that I mean a liberal democracy is not just about elections, it is about institutions, check and balance institutions defined in a constitution that prevent the executive from centralizing too much power. And so there's a limitation on power, but because the populist believes that he represents the people, that makes him or her very anti-institutional. They want to attack independent courts, an independent media, a bureaucracy, all of those institutions that limit power in a modern democracy. And unfortunately, this is what's been happening in quite a number of countries, not just here in the United States. So in Turkey, President Erdogan has basically attacked his own military, the bureaucracy, teachers, journalists. It has the largest number of journalists in jail of any country in the world right now. Viktor Orban in Hungary has done something similar since the election of his Fidesz party in 2010, where he's basically neutered all opposition parties. He's controlling the media. He's able to gerrymander voting districts to prevent his party from ever being unelected. In Poland, you had a similar attack by the Law and Justice Party on the independence of the Polish courts. And so, and the most recent case of this is in Brazil. Latin America is a little bit different from Europe, but Jair Bolsonaro, the new president-elect of Brazil, is actually makes Donald Trump look like a pussycat in many ways, because he, overtly praised the military dictatorship in the 1960s and 70s. He is racially divisive in a very, very explicit way. And so this is something that's going on in the world that is, I think, threatening democratic institutions around the world. In our country, I think that you see this anti-institutional trend in the way that President Trump has behaved since being elected. He came into office attacking the entire intelligence community. He says the press, the mainstream media, is the enemy of the American people. He's attacked judges and the courts, his own FBI, his own Justice Department, and the like. And that's in the name of the people, but as in the case of many contemporary populists, especially those in Northern Europe, when he refers to the people, it's not the whole people. It's not everybody living on the territory of the United States. There's a definite, ethnic understanding about who the real people are, which becomes really problematic in a multi-ethnic, diverse, multicultural, de facto multicultural society. So the question is, why in the middle of the second decade of the 20th century does this phenomenon arise? The most common explanation, which has been out there for the last several years, has to do with globalization, and I think that's probably true. Globalization, if you take a basic trade theory course in college, you'll learn that a regime of free trade, meaning the free movement of goods, services, investment, people, ideas across international borders, benefits everybody in the aggregate. If you listen carefully in that course, you will hear that it doesn't benefit every individual in every country. And in particular, low-skilled people in rich countries are going to lose jobs and opportunity to rising middle classes in poor countries. And that's exactly what's happened over the last 30 years with the rise of countries like China, India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and so forth. And there's been a very great increase in the amount of economic inequality in the United States. A lot of people have actually lost ground. About half of all Americans actually have incomes, real incomes, no higher than they were in 2000, 18 years ago. And so this, is clearly one of the triggers. It's connected to a social crisis in many working class communities involving crime, family breakdown, an opioid crisis, and the like. And so that is, I think pretty clearly one of the triggers for why this is going on now, a big backlash against globalization. However, I don't think that this really explains the particular character that this new populism has taken, because if it's simply a reaction to inequality, you would think actually that it's the left-wing populist parties that would really do well, the Bernie Sanders and the Occupy Wall Street movements, that sort of form of redistributionist left-wing group. They have been, they've been active, but the big phenomenon in most countries, most rich countries, has actually been the growth of right-wing populism, anti-immigrant in Europe, anti-European Union, opposed to globalization and the like. And the question is, why has the right benefited more than the left? And I think that it has to do with this question of identity. It is a cultural issue that's driving this rise of populism. So the word identity was not used commonly until the 1950s and 60s, but the concept is actually very old, and in my view, it stems from a universal human psychological trait. Plato in the Republic calls this thumos. He says the human soul has three parts. So there's a desiring part that wants food and drink and sex and cars and this sort of thing. There's a rational part that calculates one's own self-interest, right? So those first two parts are what the economists understand. The economists have this utility maximization model of human behavior where people have preferences, that's the desiring part, and they're rational utility maximizers, meaning they want to maximize their utility. What they don't get is the part that Plato refers to as thumos. This is the part of the human personality that feels it has a certain inner dignity, and it wants public recognition of that dignity, recognition by other people. And that can run counter to your economic self-interest. A lot of people actually believe that their dignity is worth a lot more than material well-being, and that is the psychological ground for this phenomenon. Now, the specifically modern form of identity is a somewhat different phenomenon. It builds off this universal human characteristic, but it is based on this notion that my inner self, first of all, there is an inner self. I have depths to my own being. Sometimes I don't perfectly understand what that inner self is, but it's there inside of me. But the important thing is the moral valuation that's given to that inner self. The inner self, the authentic inner self, is valuable, and if the surrounding society disrespects it, pays no attention to it, disregards it, it's the outside society that needs to change and is wrong, and not that authentic inner self. In a certain way, the first Western thinker that conceptualized this form of identity was actually Martin Luther at the beginning of the Reformation, because what Luther said was, all of the external rituals and laws and rules of the Catholic Church are meaningless in God's eyes. What God cares about is the inner believer. If that inner believer does not have faith, then that person is not a Christian and is not saved by God's grace. And all of the external signs of conformity to religious law defined by the Catholic Church don't count for anything. It's only the inner believer. And so you begin this process of valorizing the inner self over the outer society, and the argument then is the outer society is what has to change, and in fact, that's exactly what happened as the Protestant Reformation unfolded. You have later thinkers that present secular versions of this. So I think probably the most important was Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century. His view was that the man in the state of nature, that is to say primitive man, before the advent of society, was good, was happy, was a complete individual, and he is unhappy today because of society, because of all of the rules and norms and laws that make him conform to somebody phony, somebody that is inauthentic. And the path to human happiness is actually the recovery of that authentic self. And so you can see this, basically in every teenager that thinks that, their parents don't understand them, that they have this inner expressive self that is waiting to get out. This belief that the inner self is valuable and the outer society is false. If you think about it, that's basically what's driving the Me Too movement, right? Because women believe I'm a whole human being. I have intelligence, I have knowledge, I have skills, I have whatever constitutes my complete existence. And men are looking at me simply as a sexual object. They're only seeing one dimension, and that does not value me as I really deserve to be valued. And it's not me that has to change. I'm not the one that needs to conform to these outside expectations. It's the society that needs to change its norms. And that's in fact what Me Too is bringing about. It's really a wholesale cultural revolution in the way that we think about the relationships between men and women. All right, so that's the basic structure of identity. It's almost always inherently political because the demand for recognition of dignity has to be public, and it's in politics that you make these recognitions. All right. Now, I think that this is actually a very broad phenomenon that encompasses a lot of modern politics. We tend to think of identity politics as just something that goes on university campuses. But in fact, if you understand identity in the way that I've just described it, it's actually at the basis of a lot of modern political movements, including, just to begin with, modern democracy. So in 2011, in February 2011, there's a Tunisian vegetable seller, Mohamed Bouazizi, He had a cart that was confiscated by a policewoman. He went to the governor's office and said, "Where's my cart?" And nobody would give him an answer. And in despair at being treated in this fashion, he doused himself with gasoline, set himself on fire, and that was a trigger of the Arab Spring. It triggered revolutions in Egypt, in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya, in a whole number of other Arab countries, because many Arabs saw in Mohammed Bouazizi a reflection of themselves. They were dealing with authoritarian governments that did not treat them in the most minimal way as human beings. A human being deserves an answer, right? If you take away their livelihood as a policeman, you actually should have an answer as to what law was I violating. But they would not even talk to him. And I think this experience of being treated as less than human was the common experience that made people rise up against these dictatorships. A couple of years later, in 2013-14, in Ukraine, you had a similar uprising, the Maidan Revolution, which the Ukrainians now refer to as the Revolution of Dignity. This was about a leader, Viktor Yanukovych, that was pro-Russian. He wanted to take Ukraine back away from Europe and into this miasma of Russian kleptocracy, in which government officials became unaccountably rich because of the crony capitalism that was fed by a narrow elite of oligarchs that were self-dealing. A lot of young Ukrainians wanted to live in a society that had a modern European government, in which the government wasn't something to be exploited by elites, but was something that existed in the public interest. And that's why they staged this revolution. So a democracy gives us recognition by granting us rights. A democracy recognizes us as human beings by saying, you have a right to speech, you have a right to association, you have a right to belief, and above all, you have a right to a share in political power, which we grant you by giving you the franchise, by giving you the vote. That's the way that we consider you as human beings, equal in your ability to choose. Your dignity, your humanness lies in your agency, the fact that you can actually choose your rulers. And so in some sense, democracy itself and the emotional power of democracy builds on the fact that democracies recognize all of us on a universal basis as individuals with agency. All right? So in many respects, all of the color revolutions that have happened in various countries around the world, in Burma, in Georgia, in Hong Kong, and other places, are driven by this kind of desire for basic recognition as a citizen. Now, the problem, I think, is that this kind of universal recognition that is given us by a liberal society oftentimes is not enough. It's not enough for people, because once you live in a liberal democracy that is peaceful and prosperous, you begin to take that for granted. You begin to take that universal recognition for granted, and you begin to demand other, more particular, more specialized forms of recognition. The first major manifestation of this was nationalism in Europe in the 19th century, right? The French Revolution triggered two separate revolutionary demands. So the first was a liberal revolution about the rights of man, which were the individual rights guaranteed by, constitutions. But it also triggered a national revolution where the French people united across class lines for the first time because they all spoke a common language and had a common culture, rose up, in common to throw out the Prussians and the Austrians and other foreign powers invading their country. A nationalist feels that there is an inner community that is not being recognized. The political borders of the place that they're living in do not correspond to the cultural group that they think that they are part of and with whom they identify. And so the 19th century saw this conflict between these two forms of identity, one liberal and universal, and the other particularistic and national. And as the century went on, unfortunately, the national form of identity is the one that won out. So the Germans, were scattered all over Central and Eastern Europe. They wanted to have a single country under a single German government. They achieved this, under Bismarck. But unfortunately, as in many identity movements, that was not enough. It wasn't enough simply to be recognized as equal. There are two forms of recognition. There's what I called isothumia, meaning I want to be recognized as equal of everybody else. And so identity movements start out as a demand for equal recognition. But there's also something I called megalothumia, meaning I want to be recognized as superior. And one of the characteristics of a lot of identity movements is they move from isothumia to megalothumia, to this demand to be seen as greater. And that was obviously the trigger of the two world wars, because you had these competing nationalisms that wanted recognition, a place in the sun, in a way that was not compatible with international peace. I also think that there are other political phenomenon that can be seen through this identity lens, and one of the other manifestations, I think, is contemporary Islamism. So, we've had this experience now with Al-Qaeda, with the Islamic State, and it seems curious that all these young, especially European Muslims, would leave the relative safety and security of Belgium or France or the Netherlands or Germany to go, take up an AK-47 and fight in Syria. And I think that, in some cases it was driven by actual piety, by some religious motive that was clearly present. But I think for many people it was actually a matter of identity, especially for the European Muslims, because they rejected the religious beliefs of their parents and grandparents, which was usually village-based and very traditional. But they did not feel accepted by the European societies into which they had moved, and they were confused as to who they were. So you get a Osama bin Laden or a Baghdadi that says to them, I'll tell you exactly who you are. You're a Muslim. You're part of a great ummah. It's a proud tradition, but Muslims are being mistreated all over the world. When he was 13 years old, Osama bin Laden came into his parents' bedroom with tears in his eyes. He had been watching the mistreatment of Palestinians in Gaza, and he said, Muslims all over the world are suffering, and I think that one of the motives for going to Syria and picking up a gun is that you want to express your solidarity with this community that gives you identity, that tells you exactly who you are as a Muslim and as a member of this particular group, right? So both nationalism and religion have this identity component to them, as does liberal democracy. Now, the way that identity has played out in liberal societies, in the United States, in Britain, Australia, other developed countries, followed a somewhat different path that ultimately ended up in a strange way converging with these group identities. The original understanding of identity was very individualistic, that each one of us has a unique identity that is hidden, that needs to be recognized by other people. I think that, quite honestly, most people, if they plumb the inner depths of their soul, they find there's nothing there. I mean, there's, that actually what's underneath all the external social layers is just another deeply buried social layer. But they also feel lonely and they want to be connected to other people. And life in a modern liberal democracy does not provide them with a kind of sense of identity, belonging, and community that they are seeking. And therefore, they want to be recognized as members of particular groups. And in particular, if you are a member of a marginalized group that has suffered discrimination at the hands of the mainstream society, that sense of identity becomes a way of understanding your situation and a way of demanding redress. And that is really what happened in the United States following the big social movements of the 1960s for African Americans, with the civil rights movement, for women, with the rise of feminism, for the LGBT community, for the disabled, for Native Americans. All of these groups had been disrespected and disregarded by mainstream American society. Mainstream American society was basically white and male. You know, if you thought of yourself as an American, you were probably, you know, a white male, and you didn't think further about it, and you didn't really think of these other people as actually belonging in that identity. And as a result of real injustices and real disrespect, these social movements sought to both get that respect as distinct social groups. And this is a transformation that happened as the decades went on after the 1960s. So Martin Luther King, originally in the civil rights movement, said, we want African Americans to be treated like other Americans. We want to basically integrate into the larger society, and America should fulfill its promise, you know, as a society of free and equal people. But there were other voices within the Black Power movement that said, no, actually black people are not simply, you know, white people with a different skin color. We have our own culture, we have our own traditions, we have our own way of doing things, and it's that culture that needs to be respected. I think that this was a tendency even more prominent in feminism, where a lot of women say, you know, they said the point of feminism is not that women should act like all these boorish men. You know, there's a unique way that women are that needs to be respected as different from the way that that men are. And so each group began to emphasize its own lived experience and seek redress for the specific wrongs that were due to it. Now, I think that this was a necessary set of movements. Identity politics, you know, as I've defined it, was trying to go after real injustices. So Black Lives Matter is about police violence, and there's a lot of police violence, right? I mean, Chicago, you know, you don't have to teach that to anybody, right? So there is a real, and you know, behind Me Too, there are real injustices in the way that women are treated. The problem started to come when that group identity became all-encompassing and started to undermine the individual judgment and agency when people started being categorized as members of groups. And then this natural tendency to use group identity, you know, to build group identity by demonizing people that were not part of the group. So this was not obviously true of all identity politics as it played out in liberal societies, but there's definitely that tendency, which I think you see most pronounced in university campuses, you know, and now there's a familiar kind of conservative, you know, trope about the way that campuses have been overtaken by identity politics. Whether this is actually the case, I think empirically, I'm not so sure, but it's definitely a trend. The problem, I think, is that it has been linked now to the rise of a kind of white identity politics, which, as I said, we're seeing on display. Now, by saying this, I'm not morally, you know, I'm not trying to create a moral equivalence between the groups on the left, you know, African Americans and women, and white people, you know, that are part of white nationalist groups. Obviously, those groups are, you know, they're discriminatory, they're, you know, based on a lot of xenophobia and genuine racism. But psychologically, you have a similar kind of feeling of disrespect. The one illustration of this was given by Arlie Hochschild. She's a sociologist at Berkeley that wrote a book called Strangers in Their Own Land. So she did an ethnographic study of Tea Party voters in rural Louisiana, and her central metaphor was that they see themselves as standing in a long line in front of a house in the distance, and over the door of the house it says the American dream. They're waiting patiently, raising families, going to work every day, behaving, playing by the rules, and then all of a sudden they see other people cutting in line in front of them. So it's African Americans, women, Syrian refugees, you know, Mexican immigrants, all being assisted by elites that they think are conspiring to push these people ahead of them. And they feel disrespected by those elites. Now, this is the point. So I said I don't think that there's really moral equivalence between these Tea Party voters and these identity groups on the left, but there is some aspect of that feeling of disregard that I think is legitimate, which is that, you know, the white working class that had been, you know, the greater part of the United States population, especially in the heyday of, you know, American greatness in the 50s and 60s, has actually lost a great deal of ground economically and socially. And I think the perception that their situation, you know, the way that they were victimized actually by globalization is something, in fact, that elites have really not paid a whole lot of attention to. The elites have benefited, you know, greatly from globalization. They're the ones that are cosmopolitan. They can move around. They can take advantage, you know, of cheap labor from immigrants with their nannies and gardeners and the like. But the people that have actually lost a job in a coal mine or a steel mill or some other industry that is closed down because of outsourcing by very, you know, competitive global capitalism has never been at the center of American cultural concerns, at least not in, you know, my recent experience in this society. And in fact, you know, the social situation of a lot of these people is really not good. Opioid crisis killed, the estimate now is that it killed something like 72,000 Americans in 2017, which is about twice as many Americans as died in traffic accidents that year. So in some sense, you know, there is a genuine social crisis going on. And that, I think, is the cultural side of what's been driving the rise of this, you know, this Trump phenomenon. And it's something that I think a lot of times the elites have a hard time hearing, you know, but you see this in the reactions to political correctness. Political correctness is all about dignity. It's dignity politics, right? That you say something that is offensive or indicates that you do not understand properly the marginalized status of a particular group in society, and you suddenly are told you can't say that anymore, right? And the conditions of political correctness have changed very rapidly over time because the targets of discrimination, you know, have the attention has shifted very rapidly, and I think that part of the reason that honestly Donald Trump is popular is that he's not politically correct. People were amazed that he managed to survive the Hollywood Access tape and calling Mexicans rapists and muggers and so forth. But I think that the answer to that was that a lot of his supporters would give is, well, I actually may not agree with a particular thing he said, but he's authentic, right? And the politics of identity is about authenticity. It's about that inner self actually being able to express itself. And I think that that's actually what's driven a lot of the support that he has gotten. All right, so to wrap this up, I think that we are in a very bad place because the country is, as you can probably tell, polarized. You know, you just watch, if you watch the Kavanaugh hearings, it was pretty bad because you saw, you know, testimony by Dr. Ford and by Judge Kavanaugh, and the two halves of America just saw completely different things. They saw completely different things. And it's gotten down to the point where even the kinds of facts that you accept as factual are actually related to which of these groups you identify with, which is not the basis for deliberation or for a democratic, any kind of democratic community. And I would say that the single biggest threat to democracy in the United States now is, in fact, this degree of polarization. It means the government cannot agree on, you know, the most basic things. It means that any incident becomes politicized, and more of our institutions are now either red or blue. You know, that polarization has been creeping into sports. It's been creeping into popular culture, the kind of music we listen to, in, you know, the kinds of tastes that we have. And I think that you can't have a democracy unless you have something like national identity, right? National identity is oftentimes derided because it's related to nationalism, but it does not need to take an aggressive chauvinistic form. National identity is actually critical. If you think about what's the problem in the Middle East right now, in Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, it's that none of these countries actually has a sense of national identity. I was in Iraq in August, and the politics of that country is identity politics, basically run wild. Nobody is loyal to an entity called Iraq. They're loyal to their sect, to their region, to their ethnicity, to their tribe, but not to an overarching idea of something called Iraq. I do not think that you can have a democratic society without having something like a civic identity, or what's sometimes called a creedal identity, based on a creed. That is to say, people have to have some minimal degree of agreement on basic principles, what holds them together as a society that allows them to interact and to see the same institutions, same democratic institutions as legitimate. So for the United States, this would be something like a belief in the Constitution, a belief in the rule of law, a belief in the principle of human equality as enunciated in the Declaration of Independence. And I think that it's important to get back to an emphasis. I mean, that's what leaders need to do, to re-emphasize the need for an overarching civic national identity. So I'm going to conclude just with this observation about this very nice suggestion of President Trump about birthright citizenship that he made in the last week. So if you think about what American identity was over the years since the writing of the Constitution, up until the Civil War, it was a racial identity, right? African Americans, Native Americans, women were not given a right to vote. So it was racial and patriarchal. The United States fights a civil war. 600,000 Americans die in this war. And the one major outcome of it is the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment says all persons born or naturalized on the territory of the United States are citizens of the United States. That was a major achievement because it shifted American identity away from something that was based on race and towards something that was universal. So birthright citizenship is actually crucial to this kind of universal, creedal, liberal national identity. And there are people now in the United States that want to take that away, right? They want to walk us back to an earlier version of identity that is based on race or ethnicity. And this, I think, is not, it's simply not compatible with the kind of diverse society that America actually is. And so what I think the political agenda is to defend, the creedal identity, and it's attacked from the right. It's attacked from the left as well as from the right. But right now, much more severe threat, I think, is coming from the right. But it needs to be defended, and that's something that leaders, our political leaders, can do. I hope they, will continue this. I think there are other more specific policy ideas I have about national service, about how to deal with immigration that will also affect, the way we think about national identity. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but in the meantime, thank you very much for your attention. So I like the idea of national service. I like it for the following reason, that in the United States, we do not, we think about rights all the time, but we don't think about duties beyond paying our taxes and obeying the law and voting. So I hope you're all voting on Tuesday. The country does not ask very much of us. And I think that actually a national service where young people were expected to give like a year of their lives doing something that is in the public interest would be a very good thing to bind the country together. So military service is the only, the US military is really the only institution that brings people of different races, genders, and regions of the country and classes, social classes together. I mean, one of the things that I think is terrible about American society today is we've sorted ourselves out into these essentially class and race-based bubbles where we only deal with people that, that look like ourselves and have similar educational backgrounds and so forth. And so if you had national service, it would be something that would actually, it is a bit of social engineering. The government is being a little bit paternalistic and saying it's good for you to actually, deal with your fellow citizens. But I think it would help get people out of those bubbles and get them, working with fellow citizens. I don't think it could be mandatory. I just think politically that's a non-starter, so it would have to start out as something voluntary. But I do think that it's something that, our leaders ought to consider.
We have a question right here in the center.
So how did the Democratic Party lose the white working class?
Yeah, so this is a very important point. A lot of things happened that the Democratic Party, just like all parties of the left in Europe, had been built around the working class. So back in the 1930s, like in the 1936 election, probably 80–90% of rural whites in the South voted for Franklin Roosevelt, in his New Deal coalition because he was redistributing, the TVA. I mean, there are a lot of programs that were designed to help them. And that was one of the biggest groups within that New Deal coalition. And progressively, the white working class defected. I think it was over a lot of things. So, one just had to do with the rise of other issues that began to define the left, like environmentalism, that, a lot of white working class people felt was just killing their jobs. But a lot of it, I think, did have to do with the rise of a different sort of understanding of inequality that was based on these marginalized communities and not so much on them. And in fact, a lot of people on the left began to regard, the white working class, with its trade unions and so forth, as a kind of privileged class, and the real source of inequality were the people below them that were African American or Hispanic or female or, a member of one of the identity groups. And this defection began really in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan, and it's been continuing, I think, ever since then. And that's really why Trump won the election. I mean, it was Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin where enough of these working class voters switched sides in 2016, and that's why, Hillary Clinton didn't get the White House. And I actually think that this is a really important choice that faces the Democrats going forward because, they've got two strategic directions. So one is to double down on the existing identity groups. And to win an election, it's really tempting to do that because that's where all the activists live. That's where all the energy is. And, that's the way Obama, won 2 victories, although not by appealing so much directly to them, but, the get out the vote was based on understanding these identity groups very well. I don't think it's necessarily a good way to govern because what's been going on in the United States is that the Republican Party is increasingly becoming the party of white people, and the Democratic Party is becoming the party of minorities and women, especially professional women or middle-class educated women. And I think, it's not a good thing for a democracy to shift from disagreements over economic policy issues to identities because these identities are fixed. They're not negotiable. And as I said, you can see the problem with that in a place like the Middle East where that's all of politics. And I don't think we want to move in that direction. I'm sorry, say that again? No. So populism is not good or bad in itself. I mean, if ordinary people get upset about something, it means that something's wrong, right? And so why are people really upset with elites? Well, it's not as if the elites, both here and in Europe, have done such a great job over the last 15 years, right? I mean, they produced the Iraq War, big foreign policy disaster. They produced the subprime crisis in 2008. In Europe, they produced the Euro crisis in 2010, and then this refugee crisis in following the Syrian civil war. And so there's actually a reason for ordinary people to get upset. So, you know, populism actually can provide a lot of energy for political reform if it's used properly. You know, in many ways, Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s, responding to a much deeper crisis at that time, used that populist energy to build consensus and support behind, you know, a new American welfare state, with all of the institutions, you know, Social Security and the SEC and, you know, these big programs that were initiated at that time. And that's an example, I think, of populism being used to good advantage. But the trouble is it can also be used by demagogues and people that really do not believe in democracy. And because of this populist style that is very personalistic, it has this tendency to be anti-institutional. And that's certainly the form it's taken, you know, in this country, in Hungary and Poland, and, you know, a number of other places where it's appeared.
We have a question here in the center.
Sure. Well, following up on what you're saying. Oh, I'm over here.
Oh, okay, yeah. All right, I see you.
Where do you locate fear in your conceptualization and your schema of identity?
Yeah, well, fear has obviously been a big, it's something that's been exploited by, you know, these identitarians on the right. So that's what I was trying to say about the rhetoric coming out of President Trump this past week. Actually, American society is really good right now, right? People have jobs, we're at peace, largely at peace. People are pretty secure, and he's trying to make people believe that we're really in grave danger. And the particular danger that he's emphasizing is a danger to identity, that somehow there is an understanding of what it means to be an American that is threatened by these, you know, these people coming from Central America, that they want to steal your identity. In Europe, it's a little bit different because there, the right-wing politicians actually worry about them stealing the welfare state, that, you know, these foreigners are coming in, they're not going to pay taxes, they're going to get benefits, and that's going to undermine, you know, our welfare state. In this country, it's more, you know, about how we regard, you know, who Americans are and what they look like. And so fear is something that is, you know, that's the thing about dignity politics, is no matter how well you're doing in material terms, if you start worrying about dignity and threats to dignity, you can stoke, you know, resentment and fear at any point. And I think that's exactly what's happening in, you know, in many countries around the world.
I'm not sure this is a chicken and egg question, but here we go. Has the populists tended to polarize the politicians more, or have the politicians tended to polarize the population?
Yeah, well, so that's actually, that chicken and egg question is something that political scientists have been debating for some time. I have a colleague, Morris Fiorina at Stanford, that argued actually that Americans are not that polarized. This is based on data that, you know, was actually now getting a little bit dated, because I actually think that it's harder and harder to maintain that position. But I think it works both ways. You know, I think that we are polarized in a number of ways. Just the residential sorting that's gone on in the United States, where we live in, excuse me, increasingly homogeneous neighborhoods is one example of that, where it's coming from the bottom up. But there's no question that the elites are polarizing the country as well, beginning with, you know, the guy that happens to be living in the White House, who, you know, has seen his political fortunes tied actually to the exacerbation of that polarization. But, you know, a lot of people are guilty of that as well. It's easier to be, you know, a polarizing politician, and it kind of speaks to people's, you know, these instinctive attitudes to protect your own and to demonize, people that are different. And I think everybody has participated in that to some extent.
We have a question here on the right.
Hi. So you talk about the need to develop, say, a national American identity or to strengthen that in order to deal with challenges as a country. Mm-hmm. Would you agree that for global challenges, say global warming, that we would need to develop or foster some sort of universal human, I guess, global identity? And is that even possible when you don't have, in that case, you wouldn't really have an other to contrast your identity against?
Well, there's Martians, I mean. But yeah, no, I understand the point of your question. So I think that we've got a whole layer of problems that are global in nature. There's no question about it. So global warming is just one, but international narcotics, terrorism, just airline safety. I mean, there's all sorts of things where because of the nature of our global economy, the existing structures are really not sufficient to deal with them. And so we need more cooperation. But in my opinion, that cooperation is unfortunately going to have to be continue to be based on states, on nations. And the reason for that is that that's where the power is, right? It's only a state that can legitimately use power. And if you're actually going to do anything about, let's say, global warming, like you have standards, standards have to be enforced. Who enforces them? Well, it's a government that enforces them, right? It's not the international community. The international community has no power to enforce anything. What you can do is you can be sympathetic, you can be aware of problems that exist in other countries, you can be oriented towards cooperation, but I think that cooperation really does have to be based on countries. In Europe, they had a somewhat less ambitious project after World War II to create a European identity that I think many of the founders of the European Union hoped would replace the individual national identities of Germany, of France, of the UK, and so forth. And it's really been a failure. I mean, it was a noble try, but I think after the Euro crisis, Greeks and Germans were much more aware of how they were different than, they were aware of how much they had in common. And so I think for better or worse, we're kind of stuck with identities that have to be located somehow at a national level because that's the way we organize political power.
Great. We have time for one more question. We're going to come right up here.
Okay.
And then after we are done, we will have a book signing in the lobby. Thanks, everyone.
It appears to me that multiculturalism that has been emphasized in this country, especially by equal education, would provide more fuel for fraction instead of providing national identity, more united.
Yeah, so I agree with that. Under certain interpretations of multiculturalism, there's a big kind of philosophical issue underlying that. Does a liberal society consist of a plurality of individuals, or is it a plurality of cultures? I believe it really has to be based on individuals, because certain cultures have cultural norms that are not compatible with the basic tenets of liberal democracy. So you see this with certain, it's more of a problem in Europe than it is here, but with certain Muslim communities that discriminate against women, so they, the family sends the daughter to, back to Morocco or Pakistan, for an arranged marriage that the daughter doesn't want, and then the state has a choice of, do you side with the daughter on the basis of her individual rights as a human being, or do you say, well, this is a cultural practice and we have to respect all cultures equally? And I just think in a liberal society, there's no question that you got to side with the girl. You got to side with the individual, and it means also that all cultures are not created equal. That a liberal society, a liberal democracy, has a certain minimal set of cultural values that maintain its belief, and one of them is this belief in individual agency. And if you have cultures that really reject that, it's a problem. So I think that, I teach in an international studies institute. I teach about other countries, other societies. That's what my books are about, right? So you don't have to tell me that it's important to learn about China, about Islam, about Latin America. I think that's very clear that we need to be less parochial. But I do think that we need to also, if you're going to actually have civic education, you've got to have people understand what the origin of their own democratic, culture and values is, and that's something I think that needs to be taught, and I think that's something that's been made much harder by, certain contemporary understandings of multiculturalism. All right, thank you. Thank you very much.